Welcome to Cheating Family Tales. Please like this video and subscribe. We're grateful for each and every one of you. Let us know where in the world you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let's begin. Henry Lawson's life had always been predictable. Each day followed a routine, a comforting rhythm of work, family, and small pleasures like Sunday golf. But that evening, as he entered his home, the familiar comfort fell off as though the very air had thickened with an unspoken tension. Emma was seated at the dining table, a bottle of red wine opened, 2 glasses prepared. The sight was unusual. Emma rarely drank without an occasion, and yet here she was, waiting for him, her hands wrapped tightly around the stem of her glass. Her face was calm, but her eyes betrayed a storm brewing beneath the surface. "Hey, Henry," he greeted, forcing a smile as he dropped his keys on the kitchen counter. "What's all this? Celebrating something?" Emma's lips curved into a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sit down, Henry. We need to talk." It wasn't the words that sent a chill through him, but the tone, calculated, rehearsed. Henry's heart began to pound, a sense of dread tightening around his chest. He pulled out a chair and sat, reaching for the wine glass she poured for him. "Emma, what's going on?" he asked, his voice steady, but his mind already racing through worst-case scenarios. Emma took a sip of her wine, her gaze drifting momentarily before settling on him. "Henry, I've been thinking a lot," she began, her tone measured. "About us, about our marriage." Henry set his glass down, leaning forward slightly. "What do you mean? Is something wrong?" She hesitated, and in that pause, Henry saw the woman he had loved for more than 2 decades grappling with whatever she was about to say. When she finally spoke, the words cut through him like a blade. "I feel like I've lost myself," she admitted. "I've been your wife, the mother of our children, but somewhere along the way, I forgot who I am as a person." Henry blinked, caught off guard. "Emma, we've built a life together, a good life. What are you saying?" Her grip on the wine glass tightened. "I'm saying I need to find myself again, to figure out what I want, who I am." The pit in Henry's stomach grew deeper. "And you think you can't do that with me?" Emma looked away. "I need space, Henry. I need to explore outside the boundaries of our marriage." It took a moment for her words to register fully. When they did, Henry's world tilted on its axis. "You want to see other people?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes, just for a while, to understand what I need." The silence that followed was suffocating. Henry stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief, anger, and hurt. Henry didn't say much after that. He excused himself and headed upstairs, his footsteps heavy against the polished wood. In their bedroom, he stood before the mirror, his reflection a pale, haunted version of himself. The man staring back seemed older, more worn, as if years had passed in the span of minutes. He changed out of his golf clothes, each movement mechanical as he pulled a sweatshirt over his head. An idea struck him. A way to preserve this moment, to ensure he didn't miss a single word of Emma's betrayal. He reached for his phone, opened the voice recording app, and pressed record, sliding the phone discreetly into his pocket. When he returned to the dining room, Emma was waiting, her wine glass nearly empty. She spoke again, her words rehearsed and deliberate, outlining her plans to meet someone new. "Just for dinner," she claimed, but Henry knew better. The emotional distance between them had been growing for months, and now the gap felt insurmountable. Each word she spoke was another nail in the coffin of their marriage. But Henry stayed silent, his expression carefully neutral. Inside, his emotions churned violently, rage, heartbreak, betrayal, all battling for dominance. "I've arranged to go out this Friday," Emma said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "I'll be back Saturday morning, and we can talk then." Henry stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I think I need some air," he said, his tone flat. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed his car keys and left, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality. Henry drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring as tears threatened to spill over. Eventually, he pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the neon sign buzzing faintly in the still night. Inside, he ordered a coffee, though he had no intention of drinking it. He played the recording of Emma's confession twice, each word cutting deeper than the last. When he couldn't listen anymore, he pulled out his phone and dialed Rachel. "Hey, Dad." Rachel's cheerful voice was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. "Rachel, I need you and Ethan on the line," he said, his voice strained. "It's urgent." Rachel's tone shifted immediately. "What's wrong? Are you okay? Just trust me. Can you get Ethan?" A few moments later, the 3 of them were connected on a conference call. Henry hesitated for only a moment before pressing play on the recording. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening as Emma's voice filled the void, laying bare her plans to explore outside their marriage. When the recording ended, Rachel was the first to speak, her voice trembling with anger. "What the hell? She wants to date other men to fix your marriage?" Ethan, usually the more reserved of the two, let out a low curse. "She's lost it, Dad." Henry exhaled slowly. "I don't know what to do. I needed you both to hear it from her." Rachel's voice was firm, her anger giving her strength. "We'll figure this out together, Dad. She doesn't get to tear this family apart without consequences." Ethan agreed, his voice steady. "We've got your back." For the first time that night, Henry felt a flicker of hope. His children were his anchor, and with them by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. The next morning, Henry woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in months. His mind was no longer clouded by confusion or despair. It was sharpened by resolve. Emma's betrayal wasn't just an affront to him, it was an attack on the family they had built together, and Henry wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and sat at the kitchen table, his phone in hand. A single name sat at the top of his recent calls: Margaret Pierce. She was one of the top divorce attorneys in the city, known for her aggressive approach and sharp strategic mind. Henry had met her years ago through a mutual friend, but never thought he'd need her services. "Margaret, it's Henry Lawson," he said when she picked up. "I need your help." Margaret didn't ask many questions over the phone. She simply scheduled a meeting for later that day, her tone professional and efficient. "Bring everything you have," she advised. "The more information, the better." That afternoon, Henry met Margaret in her downtown office. The space was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Margaret, a composed woman in her early 40s, greeted him with a firm handshake. "Let's get to work," she said, motioning for him to sit. Henry laid out everything he had: the recording of Emma's confession, screenshots of text messages he had retrieved from her phone, and printed copies of emails between Emma and a man named Vincent. The messages were explicit, leaving no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Margaret reviewed the materials with a meticulous eye, occasionally jotting down notes. When she finally looked up, her expression was serious. "This is solid evidence," she said. "Clearly establishing adultery. We work heavily in the code and divorce proceedings. We'll be able to argue for a larger share of the marital assets, and with your children supporting you, we can build an even stronger case." Henry nodded, his jaw tight. "I want her to feel the consequences of her actions, Margaret. She's not just betraying me, she's betraying our entire family." Margaret's lips curved into a small, approving smile. "We'll make sure of it." They spent the next hour strategizing. Margaret advised him on the best course of action, including how and when to serve Emma with divorce papers. They agreed on a pivotal moment during her date with Vincent. The public setting would amplify the humiliation, ensuring Emma felt the full weight of her choices. The days leading up to Friday were a whirlwind of activity. Henry, Rachel, and Ethan worked together seamlessly, their shared anger and determination driving them forward. They began packing Emma's belongings, carefully boxing up her clothes, personal items, and anything else that reminded them of her presence in the house. Rachel was particularly relentless, her movements sharp and purposeful. "She doesn't deserve to stay here," she muttered, stuffing a pair of Emma's designer shoes into a box. "This house is ours, not hers." Ethan, though quieter, was just as resolute. He carried box after box out to the car, his expression set in a grim line. "She made her choice," he said simply. "Now she has to live with it." By Friday morning, the house was nearly empty of Emma's belongings. Henry had already arranged for a storage unit near her parents' home, where everything would be delivered. The locks on the doors were changed, and the house felt different, lighter, as if it were finally shedding the weight of betrayal. Henry stood in the living room, taking in the silence. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "Tonight, everything changes." Emma arrived at the upscale restaurant wearing a striking red dress, her hair styled to perfection. She exuded confidence, a woman ready to embrace her newfound freedom. Vincent greeted her with a smile, pulling out her chair as they settled in for an evening of indulgence. The restaurant was dimly lit, the ambiance intimate and romantic. Emma felt a thrill coursing through her, a mix of excitement and defiance. For the first time in years, she felt desired, alive. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, punctuated by laughter and shared glances. Emma sipped her wine, savoring the moment when suddenly a familiar figure appeared at their table. "Mom," Rachel said, her voice cold and cutting. Her eyes were sharp, filled with a fury that could ignite the room. Emma's smile froze, the color draining from her face. "Rachel, what are you doing here?" Rachel ignored Vincent entirely, her focus locked on her mother. "I could ask you the same thing," she said. "Out here on a date while Dad's at home picking up the pieces of the life you shattered." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but Rachel didn't give her the chance. "How could you do this to him, to us?" The confrontation drew the attention of nearby diners. Whispers began to ripple through the room, heads turning to watch the unfolding drama. Emma's voice was a strained whisper. "Rachel, please, let's not do this here." But Rachel wasn't done. "You didn't think twice about humiliating Dad, so why should I care about your embarrassment?" Before Emma could reply, a man in a suit approached the table, a thick envelope in hand. "Mrs. Emma Lawson?" he asked, his voice loud enough to carry. Emma's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope. "Yes, that's me." "You've been served," the man announced, placing the documents firmly in her grasp. The room fell into a stunned silence. Emma sat frozen, her eyes wide with shock as she stared at the divorce papers in her hands. Vincent shifted uncomfortably, muttering an excuse before hastily leaving the table. Rachel leaned in, her voice low but fierce. "You brought this on yourself?" Without another word, she turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Emma alone in her humiliation. The whispers grew louder, the weight of judgment pressing down on her from every corner of the room. When Emma arrived home later that night, she found the locks changed and her key useless. She pounded on the door, her desperation mounting with each passing second. "Henry!" she cried, her voice cracking. "Let me in!" Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was Henry. "Emma," he said, his tone cold and detached. "There's a letter in the envelope. Read it. Everything you need to know is there." The line went dead. With shaking hands, Emma tore open the envelope and pulled out the letter. Henry's words were direct and merciless. "Emma, you made your choice, and now I'm making mine. You've been served with divorce papers citing adultery. Your belongings have been moved to a storage unit. The key and address are included. Our children stand with me. Do not contact me except through my lawyer. This is the consequence of your actions. Live with it. Henry." Emma sank to the ground, the weight of her decisions crashing down on her. The life she had taken for granted was gone, and she had no one to blame but herself. Emma sat on the cold pavement outside her former home, the weight of Henry's letter heavy in her lap. The words were simple, but their meaning was a brutal reminder of the irrevocable damage she had caused. She had gambled everything, her marriage, her family, her home, and lost. She wiped her tears hastily and fumbled with her phone, dialing Rachel's number. It rang once, twice, before going to voicemail. Emma swallowed hard and tried Ethan next. The same result. Both of her children had shut her out. She let out a shaky breath, staring at the darkened windows of the house that had once been her sanctuary. With no other options, she gathered herself and made her way to the storage unit Henry had mentioned. The long drive through the quiet, empty streets gave her plenty of time to reflect on the choices that had led her here. The storage unit was a cold, impersonal space. Emma unlocked it with the small key Henry had included and found herself surrounded by boxes neatly labeled with her name. It was a physical manifestation of her exile. Everything she had once shared with Henry was now neatly compartmentalized and removed from the life they had built together. She spent hours sitting there, rifling through the remnants of her old life. Photographs, keepsakes, clothes. Each item was a painful reminder of what she had thrown away. By the time she finally left, dawn was breaking, and Emma felt like a shadow of the woman she had once been. Monday morning arrived with a heavy sense of dread. As Emma walked into her office, she kept her head down, hoping to avoid the curious gazes of her colleagues. But whispers followed her like a shadow, and it wasn't long before the full weight of her public disgrace came crashing down. The video of her confrontation with Rachel at the restaurant had gone viral. A fellow diner had recorded the entire scene and posted it online, where it had quickly spread across social media. The comments were ruthless, with strangers condemning her actions and labeling her as selfish and unfaithful. Her boss called her into his office by mid-morning, his expression grim. "Emma," he began, his tone heavy with disappointment. "I'm sure you've seen the video circulating online." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "This kind of publicity is damaging, not just for you, but for our company. Effective immediately, we're putting you on an indefinite leave of absence." Emma felt the ground shift beneath her. She had expected judgment from her family and friends, but the professional fallout was a blow she hadn't anticipated. She left the office with her head bowed, the reality of her new life settling in, alone, unemployed, and ostracized. Weeks passed, and Emma's isolation deepened. Her attempts to reach out to Vincent were met with cold indifference. After the public spectacle at the restaurant, he had quickly distanced himself, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. His final message to her was curt and final. "We should move on. This isn't what I signed up for." Emma tried to rebuild some semblance of a life in her small, cramped apartment, but without her family, her work, or even Vincent, the days blurred into one long stretch of emptiness. She spent her nights scrolling through old photos of her family, each image a painful reminder of what she had lost. The loneliness was unbearable. She thought about calling Henry, begging for forgiveness, but she knew it would be futile. His letter had made it clear there was no going back. Her children's silence was equally painful. The realization that they had chosen Henry over her was a wound that refused to heal. One evening, after another failed attempt to contact Rachel, Emma found herself scrolling through social media. She stumbled upon a post from Henry. It was a photo of him, Rachel, and Ethan smiling together at a family dinner. The caption read, "Stronger together." Emma stared at the screen, tears streaming down her face. The family she had once taken for granted was thriving without her, and she was left with nothing but regret. Amid the darkness, Emma began to confront the harsh truths about herself. She had spent years ignoring her own unhappiness, believing that stepping outside her marriage was the answer. But the choices she had made were selfish and short-sighted, and they had cost her everything. Determined to find some form of redemption, Emma started therapy. Her sessions were raw and painful, forcing her to confront the root of her discontent. She talked about her marriage, her affair, and the deep-seated insecurities that had driven her to seek validation from someone else. Slowly, she began to piece herself back together. She joined a local community center, volunteering her time to help others. It was a small step, but it gave her a sense of purpose. Emma also focused on rebuilding her relationship with Rachel and Ethan. She sent them letters, apologies that acknowledged her mistakes without expecting forgiveness. At first, there was no response, but over time, Rachel began to reply cautiously at first, then more openly. Their conversations were tentative, filled with unresolved pain, but they marked the beginning of a fragile reconnection. Months turned into a year, and Emma's life slowly stabilized. She found a new job, one far removed from her previous career, but fulfilling in its own way. Her relationship with her children was still a work in progress, but she cherished every interaction, no matter how small. Henry, meanwhile, had fully embraced his new life. His bond with Rachel and Ethan had only strengthened, and he had even begun dating again. The pain of Emma's betrayal still lingered, but it no longer defined him. He had rebuilt his life, and he was happy. One day, Emma received a letter from Henry. It was short but sincere, acknowledging her efforts to make amends and wishing her well. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was closure. Emma folded the letter carefully, holding it to her chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. Her journey was far from over, but she was finally on the path to healing.